I would like to thank Benny for inviting me to this conference and giving me an opportunity to present this paper. This is a joint paper with Zhaoran Gong and Wilson Tong. Zhaoran was a doctoral student of Hong Kong Polytechnic University of Wilson, and now he is in Lingnan University. So this is the work that I worked with these two co-authors when I was visiting a Hong Kong Polytechnic University during my sabbatical year. So let me start with this picture showing the increasing disparity between CEO compensation and rank and file employee wages. Now, there has been a much concern and debate about whether CEO compensation is excessive or not. So there are two schools of thought. One school of thought is that, executive pay is excessive, it's not justified by performance, and so it should be restricted, mainly argued by Lucian Babcock and his co-author. The other school of thought is that, the limiting executive pay, putting a restriction on the contract between, CEO and the shareholders is going to bring unintended consequences, and in fact, it actually may create more problems in the CEO pay than fixing the problems, argued by Kevin and his co-authors. So there are two convincing stories, but then when it comes to the empirical evidence, we have very little, simply because there is a little regulation that directly limiting CEO pay. So there have been a few, papers discussing the impact of pay restriction, the executive pay restriction. Many of them are, theoretical papers. The only empirical evidence that looks at the impact of directly limiting CEO pay or executive pay is by these co-authors. Is there many here? Many over there. So I can criticize this paper. So I'm going to comment on this paper later on, which is very related to my paper. So what we did in this paper is to look at the Chinese evidence. So in 2009, September 16, the Chinese government issued a guideline to regulate the executive compensation of central state-owned enterprises. It's a state-owned enterprises. It is endorsed by the State Council, which is the highest administrative authority in China, and it is jointly issued by 6 different departments who are managing the central state-owned enterprises one way or another. So the fact that it is endorsed by State Council and then issued by 6 different departments at the same time shows the seriousness of this regulation. This guy is the CEO of Ping An Insurance Company in China. He wasn't really popular guy in Google search, but then in April 2008, he was really, popular and the talk of the street. What happened was that his pay was disclosed in March 2008, and it turns out that his pay was almost 3,000 times the average national worker pay of the Chinese firms in 2007. So in 2007, the average worker got paid about $4,000 US. So his pay is almost $11 million, which is pretty big even in the US standard. So there was a huge public outcry over the excessive CEO pay in China. So I guess as a result of that, the Chinese government come up with this regulation, but it's only for the central state-owned enterprises. So policy was issued as a comprehensive guide on the executive compensation, but the regulation is mainly to restrict the executive compensation by setting a cap on the pay ratio between the executive compensation and the employee wages. The exact formula of the cap is not known to the public. It is confidential information. But then the motivation of the regulation is mainly to restrict the CEO compensation. So there are few advantages of this experiment. The government regulation is arguably exogenous to firm performance, so we can mitigate the endogenous bias between CEO pay and firm performance. And not only that, the regulation is only applied to the centrally administered state-owned enterprises, CSOE, but not to the other firms in China. So the other group of firms is locally administered state-owned enterprises and the private companies. So we can conduct the difference in difference test before and after regulation and between the CSOE and non-CSOE. So basically that's what the paper does. So we ask 3 questions. So first one is whether pay restriction reduce CEO pay. That actually is not an interesting question. It's the question of whether this regulation is a binding constraint or not. What's more interesting question is how does that pay restriction affect the CEO incentives? And then finally we try to see whether regulation has any impact on the firm performance. Okay, so as for sample, we look at all listed firms in Shanghai Stock Exchange and the Shenzhen Stock Exchange. We use the database called SISMA, China Securities Market and Accounting Research Database. It's a Chinese version of CompuStat and CRISP combined. Okay, we look at the sample period from 2005 to 15. The CEO compensation data is not really reliable before 2005, so we started from 2005. As for the compensation variable, we look at the cash salary and cash bonus only. We didn't look at the incentive compensation because during our sample period, very few firms have the stock options. And even if they want to grant the stock option, they need to get approval from the CSRC, which is Chinese version of SEC. So the stock options are not popular in China at this moment. So we only focus on the cash compensation, salary and bonus. So this is the median compensation during our sample period. The blue line is the CSOE, CEO compensation in Chinese yuan. So 2005 is about 300,000 yuan, which is like 45,000 US. And then that increased to 600, it doubles by 2009 and 10. And then starting from 2010, which is after the regulation, the pay is more or less stabilized, doesn't increase. Whereas the non-SOE, the pay level is lower, but then the firm size is much smaller. So even though the pay level of CSOE is higher, doesn't necessarily mean that they are overpaid. So as for the non-SOE, it continues to increase even after 2000. So it seems that the pay restriction is binding. So as an incentive variable, we look at the per consumption. As for per consumption, we look at the sum of 6 different types of expenses, including traveling, business, entertainment, overseas training, and so on and so forth. And the previous literature shows that in China, perks often granted as allowances, and unused part, they can just take home. So it is a managerial excess. The amount of the per consumption is, in fact, is unbelievably high in China. One of our sample forms, the Sinopath, the 1 month alone, the per consumption was like 100,000 US dollars for wine consumption. So per consumption is quite excessive. And this is the evidence. So for CSOE, we look at the per consumption per executive. So initially it's about 1,200. Until 2009-10, it's a little increase, but then since 2009, there's a huge increase. And then since 2012, there's a big drop. That is mainly because of the anti-corruption campaign initiated by Xi Jinping since late 2012. So you can see that there's a huge drop. Whereas the non-SOE is more or less stable, but then increase a little bit later on. So, I think this evidence is quite striking. As soon as they pay, cash pay is cut, they increase the per consumption tremendously. As another incentive measure, we look at the what we call tunneling. Tunneling is a terminology coined by Simon Johnson and his co-authors in the 2000 AER paper. It's a way, it's an activity of the extracting farm resources for your own benefit. So I have a paper showing that in South Korea, the business groups tunnel a lot using the mergers and acquisitions. In Chinese context, Charles Lee has a paper showing that the net other receivable is a good proxy for tunneling. So net other receivable, much of it is basically intercorporate loan. So insiders get loans from the company they're working. So, you get loan and you don't pay interest and you don't return principal. So you just get cash home. So, there's much literature showing that the net other receivable is indeed a good proxy for tunneling. And this is what we found. So CSOE until 2009-10, it's more or less the same, but then after 2010, you can see there's a huge increase. Whereas the non-SOE, it increases a bit, but then not to the level of the CSOE. So we did first a univariate DID test. So what we did is we run the regression of the outcome variable on firm fixed effect and year fixed effect, and we take the average residual of outcome variable between the two sub-periods, before regulation and after regulation, and then we conduct the univariate DID test. So as for CEO compensation, before regulation, CSOE was positive, but then after regulation it's negative, so there's a big drop in the compensation, net of the year and firm fixed effect. whereas the non-CSOE, you don't see much difference. As far as the T statistic is concerned, although I didn't show, it's greater than 3, so I think I'm okay with that. As for the power consumption, I will have to speed up. So there's a big increase in the power consumption by CSOE, whereas the non-CSOE, there's a decrease. Net other receivable, which is a proxy for netting, we can see that there's a big increase for CSOE, but not for the non-CSOE. So what we argue is that when your pay is cut in cash currency, then you gotta look for a way to make up for the reduced salary, and in Chinese context, they increase the power consumption, and they steal more. So is it going to affect the firm performance? Yes. We argue that because of the distorted incentive, firm performance dropped. We use a return on sales as a measure of performance rather than stock return, because in China, stock prices tend to move together. Randall Moore has a paper showing that in China, stock prices move together on the market, so it's not easy to sort out the abnormal performance using stock return. So we use return on sales, and there's a drop in performance. Now, one issue that I have with this paper is that the regulation period, which is 2009, overlap with the crisis period. So, it could be that what we found is a crisis-driven effect. So during the crisis, CSOE, suffered more, so their pay is cut, so they steal more and consume more. So it is a crisis-caused performance decline that drives our finding. So on the one hand, we talk about the T statistics being greater than 3, but then we have a very strong evidence, and then the critique is that it's something obvious. So what we did is that if crisis-caused performance drives our evidence, if crisis-caused performance drop, incentivize managers to turn in more and consume more porks, then we should see a more significant increase in pork and the net other receivable from those CSOE with a poorer performance during crisis or after crisis. So what we did, we partitioned the sample, CSOE sample, into 2 groups by looking at the performance change around the crisis period. One with the high performance, the other lower performance. So if the crisis-caused performance drop drives our evidence, we should see that for this group of CSOE, we should see a more increase in the pork consumption and turnover. But we don't see that. Actually, the test of equal coefficient, we cannot reject them all. So we argue that it's not, they may have contributed, but it's not the crisis, rather the regulations. So that's what we argue. And then we have run a bunch of Robertson's tests. The Edman and his author have a survey paper showing that putting social pressure through low pay ratio, setting a pay cap on executive compensation is going to lead to unintended consequences, and I think our evidence support their view. But the Chinese market is different from the developed market, so we acknowledge that our evidence may not be generalizable by the countries. In fact, the Israeli evidence is the opposite to what we found. So I think in 2016, the Israeli Congress passed a law setting the cap of 30 times. The CO pay cannot be more than 35 times of the lowest worker rate. And on that day, they run the event study and found positive market reaction. So their interpretation is that the CEO contract may not be optimal. Setting a cap may be a good thing. Whereas we argue that setting a cap may lead to some unintended consequences. So I think there's much room for further study in